This is Patrick Hall. Thanks for joining us for our webinar on the effects of e-cigarettes and vaping on lung cancer with Dr. Peter Shields. We'll give everybody another minute or two to connect to the presentation. We have a number of attendees registered, and I can see the attendee count going up as we hit the 11:30 mark. So people are joining us now, and we'll get started in another minute or two. Thanks.
Patrick?
Yes.
I'm here. I just wanted to let you know.
Oh, great. Thank you. We are broadcasting. Thank you.
Oh, sounds good. Thanks.
We'll get started here in another minute or so. I can see we still have a number of folks still connecting. Thanks. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. Our presentation today is on the effects of e-cigarettes and vaping on lung cancer. We're joined by Dr. Peter Shields, medical oncologist at the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center, who specializes in the treatment of lung cancer. He's also the deputy director of Ohio State's Comprehensive Cancer Center and oversees the scientific research programs and research infrastructure at the OSUCCC James that includes more than 300 cancer researchers and their teams from 12 of Ohio State's 15 colleges. Just briefly, I'd like to remind you of the CancerBridge service and the capabilities that are provided to you by your employer. CancerBridge is a cancer-focused navigation service that provides you or your immediate family with immediate one-on-one personalized access to a physician like Dr. Shields, who is an expert in your specific type of cancer. We provide immediate expert guidance at a time of uncertainty. CancerBridge is a very simple service. You call in via our toll-free number. Call is immediately answered by an oncology nurse who will triage the call, figure out where you're at in your cancer journey, provide you the opportunity to speak to an expert, again, like Dr. Shields, and then she'll follow up with you after that call to see if you have any additional questions and help you navigate the cancer landscape. CancerBridge provides you somebody knowledgeable who'll listen, rapid access to an expert in your specific cancer, and help you gain an understanding about your specific cancer. We really try to provide guidance on next steps and avoiding mistakes, navigating you through the healthcare landscape, as well as providing immediate answers during a time of crisis. CancerBridge is not just for you as an employee, but also for your family. So your parents, parents-in-law, spouses and partners, children and siblings are all eligible to contact our service. They would just need your employee identification number when they call in. Important things to think about on why a typical general practitioner or oncologist cannot provide this service. Our research shows that there are over 200 types of cancer, and that number is growing. And community cancer doctors are generalists with a basic knowledge of the most common cancers and don't have easy access to expertise like Dr. Shields and his colleagues can provide. Our cancer experts are each invested in one particular type of cancer, and they know all the presentations and the latest and best treatments for that cancer. They evaluate and treat only patients with that cancer and advise the community on that cancer. More importantly, they perform and publish research in that cancer, and they lecture around the world teaching medical students, residents, and fellows about that cancer, and they know and network with other experts across the world in that cancer. To learn more about CancerBridge, you can visit our website, mycancerbridge.com, or speak to your HR team to gather more information. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, you can ask them through the questions panel in GoToWebinar. And if anything comes up after the presentation, please email us at questions@mycancerbridge.com. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and make Dr. Shields the presenter. and he's going to be talking about the effects of e-cigarettes and vaping on lung cancer.
Okay, let's see. Hello, everybody. Good morning. You have slides up?
Yes, we do. Looks good.
Okay, perfect. And let me just add one thing real quick to Patrick. I could say it a little bit differently. So we at the James as physicians are, to be very egotistical, but super specialists. Each of us do just one cancer. I only do lung cancer cases. And you know, we're happy to treat anyone who walks through the door, but we're also very happy to give second opinions, and people travel from large and far places to get those second opinions. And as I explain to my patients, it's easy that their doctor may be smarter than every one of us here, but I don't think I'm smart enough to keep up with every cancer that's out there. When you think about these folks in private practice, you know, when they're treating everything from breast cancer, prostate cancer, gastric cancer, leukemia, et cetera, I don't think I'm smart enough to keep up with every cancer. And so we're really happy is just a double check to make sure things are going right and to come see us before there's any change in care or treatment decisions. We'll get you in one way or another. Having said that, I'll go into these slides now. And so I'm going to be talking about electronic cigarettes, big hot issue. It has a way of impacting tobacco control through the whole spectrum from kids to adults. So here are the major issues about these things. So first, let me just say, and I'll go into more detail, but electronic cigarettes, if you don't know, and I guess I should assume that you wouldn't be joining if you didn't know what they are. But these are new products. They sort of hit the market around 2007 here in the US, invented in China. And it's a way of inhaling nicotine through vapor type devices and touted as an alternative to cigarettes. So there are major issues about these products. And so first of all, no question about kids are using them. And so we worry that using a nicotine inhalation device could be a gateway to kids who transition from cigarettes to, from e-cigs to cigarettes. And even if they don't, it sort of normalizes the practice of smoking and inhaling things into the lungs. So that's one side. So we worry about kids. These things are touted as a way of helping people either quit smoking or reduce the number of cigarettes per day. And so if this is another smoking cessation tool, that would be great. It's been touted by industry and sometimes echoed in the media that electronic cigarettes could be the end game to tobacco because everybody will switch because they really just want their nicotine. Turns out it's not that simple. But even if it helps people cut the number of cigarettes, you know, in half. So a pack-a-day smoker smoking 20 cigarettes, if they start using an e-cig and they're smoking 10 cigarettes, at least as a hypothesis, that might be less harmful. And of course, if we can get people to quit with smoking e-cigs, that would be great. Okay, so let me just point out a couple of things. Then I want to actually take my slides out of order, and I thought maybe it'd be helpful to show you some pictures of what e-cigs are that I have later in this talk. But first of all, let me just say that there's very important principles around electronic cigarettes and generally for tobacco control. We all know that cigarette smoking is a huge burden, still accounts for way too many diseases. Smokers on average will die 10 years younger than non-smokers, and virtually everyone who's a smoker, a regular smoker, will die of some tobacco-related disease, whether it's a cancer such as lung cancer, heart disease, or stroke, or lung disease. So the first principle that we follow when we think about electronic cigarettes is tobacco control works, meaning we have ways now to get smokers to quit and to prevent kids from taking up cigarettes. So first principle is tobacco control works. Second principle is tobacco control works. Third principle is tobacco control works. And the fourth principle is that tobacco control works, but it's still just not good enough. And now I'm just going to interrupt my slides for a second. I just want to scroll down to show you this slide. There it is. Okay, so what are electronic cigarettes? They come in literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of types of designs. Any company before last year, if they were making them, they could design them any way they want and put them out on the market. So they can look like cigarettes, what we call cigalites. Then there are these tank systems where you can buy the device and then you mix the e-liquids of any flavors, and there's thousands of flavors, and you can go online and go into a vape shop and get these things formulated for you, and they can taste anything from, you know, vanilla flavored to licorice flavor to tobacco flavor. There are even flavors out there like T-bone steak versus ribeye steak, if you could tell the difference between the two of them. Then these devices also come as hookahs. You know, they're basically electronic. They've got a battery in them, and they have the liquid. And basically what they are is a carrier for nicotine. So what seems like a relatively simple design in those liquids is basically propylene glycol and glycerin and flavors. Now these propylene glycol and glycerin and flavors are generally regarded as safe. And by that I'm having quotes, which is a Food and Drug Administration term. And that is used for what could be safely added to foods or cosmetics. And so these are in our foods and cosmetics, and we eat them all the time, or put them on our skin, and there's no issues about them. What we don't know is whether there's issues about this and or with flavors, plus adding nicotine causes problems in our lungs, potentially causes heart disease or cancer, and this is what we're trying to figure out, and that's what I'm going to update you for. So let me just take that off a second and go back to where I was. So what a lot of people don't know is that we have actually a very, very powerful tool now in tobacco control. So Congress in 2009 gave the Food and Drug Administration authority to regulate tobacco products. Before that, most people don't realize, the federal government in its entirety could not regulate tobacco products, with the exception of saying that the tobacco company can't lie about their product. Otherwise, when the Food and Drug Administration was formulated back in the 1930s, there was actually one line put in there, presumably by some lobbyists for the tobacco industry, that said, while the Food and Drug Administration could regulate food and drugs, it should never apply to a tobacco product. So Congress had to change that, and they did in 2009. And part of, sorry, this shouldn't have skipped. Here we are. So Congress now can restrict the advertising and promotions. They can put additional restrictions on sale to minors. They could ban flavors. They can, and the focus with e-cigs is that they may establish performance standards or evaluate health claims about purported what we call modified risk tobacco products, which is what an e-cig is. So you can imagine that if the FDA, through science, learns that there's a way of making a cigarette safer or driving people from cigarettes to e-cigs, because e-cigs are safer, they can establish policies and regulations to do that. FDA also has the authority by Congress to put graphic warning labels on cigarettes and smokeless tobacco, and by that I mean huge pictures of very, very graphic warnings that, you know, about lung cancer and heart disease and birth defects and that sort of thing. And that's been sort of caught up in the courts, actually, and been put on hold. So they've also have the ability to investigate the impact for reducing nicotine in cigarettes, and I'll mention this in the next slide. But what they can't do, according to the law that was established in 2009, is ban cigarettes or nicotine. And, you know, if you think about it, the Food and Drug Administration applied what they do for foods and drugs. They would have to ban nicotine and especially cigarettes, because there's no redeeming value and they're clearly harmful. But Congress, as part of this law, I guess they compromised and put that in. So currently, the FDA is considering a number of different ways of dealing with cigarette smoking. And these things, some of these things can actually potentially wipe away cigarette smoking. So we probably have the tools already, okay? So for example, the FDA is actively funding studies to reduce nicotine content of cigarettes. So imagine if they can't ban the nicotine, but they can require the tobacco companies to reduce the nicotine content to a level below which it's addictive. So kids can smoke, but they won't become addicted. Adults can choose to buy the product if they want to. You know, we could buy other risky products, whether it's anything from alcoholic beverages to bungee jumping, you know, risky activities, you could buy it. But if it's not addictive, then that would really be free choice. Problem, of course, right now is the nicotine is really an incredibly powerful addictive drug. And so when kids start, and they get addicted to nicotine. It's what I call a disease of adolescence, because every kid who starts smoking, it's usually, you know, between 11 and 18 years old, more or less, and they all think they're immortal. They all think that they could stop smoking, and they all think that they're not going to be harmed by these cigarettes until 2 to 3 years later they're actually addicted. So if they reduce the nicotine content, these kids wouldn't get addicted. These studies are coming out, are actually stunning about how effective these are. The FDA could also reduce harmful constituents within smokeless tobacco or cigarettes. And they can reduce the flavors in non-cigarette tobacco. So there's a lot of, you know, the mini cigars and hookahs and that sort of thing where people smoke them because of flavors. The FDA could just say, take the flavors out. I'll mention this in a second, but we're leading a big effort here to change the cigarette filter design so that the filters work better and cause less perceptions among smokers that the filters are delivering a safer smoke. And then, of course, they can regulate electronic cigarettes. And they could do anything from make the industry have safer batteries so they don't blow up on planes or in suitcases, but they can also regulate what's in the aerosols and identify things that might be more or less harmful. So the problem that we have with electronic cigarettes or with any harm reduction strategy is that you may, if a smoker switches to an electronic cigarette and they never go back to smoking, because an electronic cigarette doesn't have all those combustion products like putting your head in a fireplace, the electronic cigarettes are likely to be safer. So if a smoker switches to an electronic cigarette, their individual risk may decrease. But the FDA uniquely has to also consider what happens to the population. So if a smoker switches to electronic cigarettes, and that's progress because they have less combustion products going into their lungs, but if you have more kids starting to use e-cigs and those kids transition to cigarettes, or you put these on the market and smokers who might have otherwise quit don't because they think they could, instead of smoking 20 cigarettes a day, they smoke 15 and then smoke e-cigs 5 times a day, they might think that that's better, but it's not. So you could end up with individual risk getting better, but it's weighed against overall population harm, which could be worse because it could drive more people to be using cigarettes. So the big debate in public health and in the media is when people talk about electronic cigarettes is what's the comparator? Okay, so electronic cigarettes compared to smokers, if they completely switch, I think most people agree would be progress for them. Now, we would rather not have anything go in their lungs, but if you gave me as a choice as a physician, and some of my patients do, of either smoking or vaping with e-cigs, I'll choose the e-cigs. Now, of course, I'll say to them, but it's bad for you to put any of this stuff in your lungs. We just don't know about the safety issues, but I'll agree that it's probably safer than smoking. But what about if the comparator is former smokers? So here you have these people who successfully quit, and a lot of smokers, you know, dream about smoking and the pleasures of smoking years later. If they say, oh, great, now I now have a safe alternative to the cigarettes, and they start smoking their e-cigs, and they now have the reintroduction of the nicotine hit going to their brain, they end up smoking, that's a bad thing. And then, as I said, if we have never smokers who transition to e-cigs and then to cigarettes, that could be a bad thing. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then, of course, we have dual users. And so if it doesn't decrease the amount of smoking, and in fact, what happens is if smokers, they're not allowed to smoke during the day at work, but they're now all of a sudden allowed to smoke indoors with e-cigs, they're now getting more nicotine per day, they may readjust their nicotine thermostat and smoke more overall. So I have to tell you that while we all probably agree that, or most people will agree that smokers who switch completely to e-cigs is better, everything else I just told you is entirely speculative. So we have no idea whether or not having e-cigs on the market will get more former smokers to go back to cigarettes. Or is that going to be trivial compared to the amount of smokers who switch to e-cigs, and so on and so forth. So what we have to think about in smokers, okay, is that we know that smokers compared to non-smokers have a lot more disease. Let's say it's lung cancer here. The question is, for people who switch, what's the toxicity of that e-cig, if any, And at what age of the smoker is it that they're going to switch? Are they going to get any benefit, or do they really just need to quit if they're going to have a benefit? So what we don't know is a smoker after all these years, if they don't completely quit and drop their cancer risk, how much reduction might they have? And this is a big open research question that the FDA and others have to grapple with. But if you're here and an e-cig, because it's still delivering certain, bad chemicals that are irritants that cause inflammation, and so your risk only goes down to here, which is much smaller than here if they completely quit, this may not be good enough. And maybe e-cigarettes are going to hurt us more than help us across the population. Let me skip over that. Okay, so I'll just want to say one thing. So I mentioned before about these filter holes. So cigarettes now are currently designed, almost all of them, which used to be called light cigarettes, and even the regular cigarettes, have these little holes in the filter paper which allow air to mix with the smoke. And on a smoking machine, you get a lower tar and nicotine yield. And the industry advertised these things as being safer, basically every smoker now, or most smokers now, smoke these types of cigarettes, these light cigarettes, although they're not allowed to call it light anymore. And overall, we've also learned that probably those filter holes actually made for a more dangerous cigarette. We just had a big publication on that, and it was a lot in the media. My point is here, and the reason why I decided to show you these slides, even though I was going to skip over them, is that we've been through this before. The tobacco control community is extremely wary of new products introduced by the tobacco industry, because no pun intended, but it is, we all got burned around these light cigarettes issue. Okay, so doctors back in the 80s, the public health community was telling people that if you can't quit, then switch to lighter cigarettes, and that was a bad recommendation. People got hurt because of that. So we're really being cautious around e-cigs. Some people, and maybe it's appropriate, are saying that some of us are being overly cautious because of this bad experience. So I mentioned what e-cigs were, a variety of types of products. One of the challenges we have is we have a lot of e-cig studies going on, but when we take a person and we put them on electronic cigarette in a clinical trial, for example, one of the challenges we have is we may have good research results, but it's only about that one product. So if you study this product, you have no idea about maybe if that's related to this product or any of the other types of products on the market. So a lot of this controversy is really front and center in many different ways. So in 2015, Public Health England, which is the equivalent of our Health and Human Services, issued this report that basically said that, in a nutshell, best estimates show e-cigarettes are 95% less harmful to your health than normal cigarettes, and when supported by a smoking cessation service, help most smokers to quit tobacco altogether. And when we saw this, and there was a lot of media attention, a lot of people got really upset because they didn't have any research results that they were looking at that we also don't have. And we came to not the conclusion that e-cigs were safer or not safer, but certainly based on the available data, it was reckless to make this type of claim. And so there were lots of different editorials out, created a lot of controversy, and that a very prestigious journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, someone who wrote an editorial said the dominant policy perspective in the United States serves as a foil to the one embraced in England, with a tight focus on potential risk to children and non-smokers. E-cigs are out of the question. So some people here are so convinced that there's a risk to kids that they're willing to say, I don't want to take a chance of putting another smoking cessation device on the market because we're going to hurt more kids than we're going to help smokers, because they're really not going to help them to quit, or it's too toxic, or that sort of thing. And there have been tons of editorials basically based on no data, or very, very limited data. And so, you know, the professional associations, like the ones we're involved with, the American Cancer Society, American Association of Cancer Research, Heart Association, what we're basically saying is, right now you can't recommend it, or you shouldn't recommend it, you should not recommend it. Work with your patients if they insist on using these things. Let them know that there's known ways to help you quit, and that we need the data. And we need regulation of these products, because right now, you know, you can have a product that's delivering the vapor at very high voltages with higher contents of irritants and things that can cause toxic reactions in the lung and that sort of thing. So who's using these products? And here's one of the conundrums. So if you ignore, so this is e-cigarette use in kids over time, clearly going up until 2016, and cigarette smoking going consistently down. Until we saw this data just recently, this was reported June 2017, we didn't have this one black bar here. And so, so all we knew was that e-cigs were going up and cigarettes were going down. And the debates were incredible because what people were saying is, oh, look at this. These kids are using e-cigs and they're not using cigarettes. That's real progress, even if they get addicted to the nicotine. And other people say, wait a minute. Nicotine is bad for kids' brains as they're developing based on a bunch of animal studies. So we shouldn't be promoting this at all. And what they say is that tobacco, use of cigarettes were going down already. And this is good tobacco control policy, like raising the prices, better education, making it harder for cigarettes to get in the hands of kids. And so what they were saying was that e-cigs is slowing down this, and that look how here it's leveling off. So last year we see that e-cigs have now gone down, and so is cigarette smoking. And as we are sitting here in November 2017, waiting for the data for this current year, we'll see whether or not these are just blips, okay, and this starts going up, or this continues to go down, and this continues to go down. So it's very interesting data, very provocative data, and there are studies going on, like what we have here in Ohio, funded here at Ohio State, to see whether or not these kids are actually transitioning from e-cigs to cigarettes. It's a legitimate concern, but right now speculative. And I've had people from the industry say to me, come on, you have a kid who's addicted to nicotine on e-cigarettes. We all agree that that's not a good thing. But if they would have been smokers already, isn't that a good thing? And the whole gateway thing is silly because a kid who's smoking gummy bear flavored e-cigs and gets addicted to nicotine are not going to switch to the dirty flavored cigarettes and with all the other toxic effects. So, this is, to be determined. So cigarette use across adults and kids from data published just this year, although already, from 2014, it's already outdated. That's one of our problems here, is that the whole e-cig issue is moving so fast that when you've seen data, it's almost outdated by the time you read the article. And so you could see that for cigarette use, defined as use in any time in the previous 30 days, 12 to 14-year-olds is about 1.4% across the country. 15 to 17-year-olds goes up to almost 8%. And then by the time they get to be 18 to 24, it's almost 30%, so 29%. So that's a huge number. And then some of these folks, fortunately, do quit, and they just don't become addicted. And so it's about 21% overall. E-cigs, so if you look at the 12 to 14-year-olds, it's about the same number. So that's a little concerning, although by 15 to 17-year-olds, it's a little bit lower, but still close to the same number. And then adults, young adults 18 to 24, it's a lot less. Okay, so the question is it kids who are transitioning from this to this, or kids are just not bothering? So this is what we don't know, but we're closely, obviously, watching these trends. The media, as you probably know, is really, really pushing these products. There's a lot of health claims that are illegal, but the FDA can't, catch up with manufacturers in China who put this stuff on websites. But you won't inhale any of the carcinogens. This helps people quit smoking. All of it illegal by the FDA, but as I said, it's really hard for them to catch up with. And then doctors are really, really, I won't say confused. I think they're, I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I'll tell you the results of this study, which is that about 30% of the doctors were actually recommending e-cigs to patients to quit. And that's really not based on evidence. So this is something that we're trying to, get the evidence as quick as possible. All of these products, even the ones that look alike, all behave differently, and this is what the FDA needs to regulate. A lot of them have no quality control, so they're way off in the amount of nicotine they claim they deliver. The flavors could be bad, the batteries could be bad, that sort of thing. But we do know is that how that e-cig is designed. So for example, those that have higher voltages can increase the levels of things like formaldehyde and acetaldehyde and acrolein. At best, these are very highly irritant things you're putting into your lungs, and potentially even carcinogenic. So does these things help people quit? So there's studies here. I'm not going to go into the details, but some of them are quite large. Of 111 smokers provided e-cigs. Some of them are smaller. But basically, when you give a smoker an e-cig in a clinical trial, they're interested in wanting to quit, even though they say they may not want to quit. That's why they're coming into the trial. And they're going to reduce their toxic exposures to bad things in cigarettes if they completely switch. Okay, so that would be enough to say that that's a good thing. The question is what's happening in the real world and not people who are showing up for clinical trials. And I think what we're seeing now, based on data that's emerging, is that a lot of cigarette users are using the e-cigs, but ultimately they're not quitting. So they may quit for a month or two and then they go back for smoking. My own personal view, based on just talking to my patients, if e-cigs were going to be so great to be the tobacco end game, then all of my patients would be coming and using e-cigs. And that's not the case. Some become long-term e-cig smokers, but most of them don't. And they either go back to smoking or they end up quitting with some other method. So I just want to give you a sense of what's going on here at Ohio State before I start wrapping up. And that is that we have a number of different studies funded by the federal government where we're following 1,200 kids and their families to see how they use tobacco products, including e-cigs. We're following adult tobacco users to see how they use e-cigs and whether they quit. We have, I'll mention in a second, studies going on of people who are actually using e-cigs and not, and looking for lung toxicity. We have a large grant we just got funded to look at what happens if we start using those filters without ventilation and whether that could cause harm and backfire on us. And I will mention that. So one of the projects that I just want to give you a sense of that we have under review right now is that we have people who are willing to undergo a procedure called bronchoscopy. Looks kind of awful, where a tube goes into the nose, into the lung. It's an outpatient procedure. It takes 20 minutes. Under sedation, and there are people who are really kind enough, and of course they get there's incentives and monetary incentives. They come in, and we've been doing bronchoscopies on people who have never smoked and people who've been using e-cigs for at least 6 months, or people who are regular smokers, and we've been doing all sorts of tests on their lung specimens for what mostly amounts to inflammation. And one of the things that we're seeing, which we're trying to understand more about, but seems fairly consistent. If you take the fluid from someone's lungs, so you have the tube in someone's lungs, you shoot some salt water into it, you suck that salt water back, you look at what you get back. And we've known for a long time that if you compare a never smoker's lungs to a smoker's lungs are black. And that's all the smoking. And so these are cells in here that basically have all the particulates accumulated. What we've been finding is that e-cig users are somewhere in between. Oops. Okay, and this one's pretty convincing. Not all of them are this convincing, but this is a good example. And so what we don't know is that, you know, a never smoker compared to a smoker clearly has a lot more of this black stuff, which are inflammatory cells and proteins that cause inflammation that are thought to be part of the pathway of cancer and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. But we don't know is that, okay, if smoker switches to an e-cig and they get reduced inflammation, is this reduced inflammation enough? And does e-cig still have some level of inflammation that stops them from going back? Sorry, I don't know why this is so sensitive. Stops them from going back and looking more like this. Or maybe they'll never go back, even if they quit smoking. So those are the types of studies that we're doing now. So just to sum up, major issues. Are e-cigs risk to adolescents and young adults? Is it a gateway? You know, that's speculative, but an important concern because we don't want to find out 20 years from now that we had a big mistake by not regulating these enough. Is it a harm reduction product? So we know that when smokers use e-cigs and cigarettes, if they reduce enough, their markers of harm and exposure will go down, but is it enough? We don't know. And does it promote smoking cessation? So the early data is positive, but we really don't have the good trials and studies to know if they're good enough or not. And, you know, and quite frankly, if they are as good as nicotine replacement therapy or some of the drugs we have on the market to help people quit, then that'd be great because we love another tool. Some people might use this rather than something else. And importantly, we know that tobacco control works. So we have to regulate all of tobacco in the context of a very complex tobacco product market that's now changing. So I'll stop there. And I guess we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, this critical information, and thank you for your work on this issue as well. We do have some questions that are coming in. from the audience. Again, if you have questions, please ask them through the questions panel inside of GoToWebinar. But one of our first questions comes, we've had it from a couple different parents. At what age would you recommend talking to children about the dangers here? I think you had an uptick on your slide there at around age 12 or 14.
Yeah, so that's boy, I could talk about that for 20 minutes. And to disclose this, I have a 7 and a 9-year-old at home. So first of all, kids get really good education in elementary school about the evils of smoking and how bad it is, and that's a great thing. And I will tell you that I think it should be, at that point. But here's the challenges we all have face as parents: is your strongest advocate for not smoking are your 5th graders. And then as soon as they hit 6th grade and they start seeing the bigger kids smoking, all that goes out the window. And they see the peers, they see their how cool it is, and it all gets normalized. And so it's a continuous conversation, up to all the way through young adulthood.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you have any resources that you could recommend for assistance on stopping? Cessation is a big part of the mission here. Is there anywhere you direct people to?
Sure. There's a ton of resources, and I won't. We have smoking cessation clinics here, but I would actually start with there's a number of very good websites that you can find through the American Cancer Society or the Legacy Foundation is another one. There's all sorts of apps. Certainly your physician could do it, but there's you can buy over the counter nicotine replacement therapies, and I would definitely recommend getting the tools, learning how to do it. Most people just do quit on their own, but for some people, those are the people who are smoking outside in 10-degree weather or have a close relative or spouse who dies of lung cancer and they keep smoking. Nicotine addiction is not a voluntary thing. It's not like people are choosing to do that. Most smokers you talk to would love to, to quit. They understand the health issues. They know it's very expensive. And so, but a lot of people need help. You have to learn how to identify the triggers. You need to learn how to react when you're around other smokers or you smell cigarette smoke. Many cases you might need the nicotine for some period of time so you don't get the cravings. So there's lots of ways to start online. As I said, the American Cancer Society has information. National Cancer Institute, your doctor should have information.
Are you seeing much difference in the recommendations for cessation from users of traditional cigarettes versus e-cigarettes? Are the pathways or modalities there different?
Boy, so there's no guidelines that I know of trying to get people on e-cigs to quit. What I tell my patients, just from my own experience, is that if they're using e-cigs, so I see lung cancer patients, so they're going to be smokers who are using e-cigs, that my first preference is they don't put anything in their lungs. If the e-cigs are not sufficient in satisfying their cravings, then they should add like a nicotine patch to it, because these smokers are so used to a lot of nicotine that nicotine patches or gum are not going to make them overdose. Very, very unusual if you do, and that overdose is like drinking too much coffee, so you get a little jittery and then it'll go away. For younger adults who we see who get addicted to nicotine for e-cigs, I guess I would do the same sort of thing, which is try to have them think about their triggers. I'd rather have them not put anything into their lungs and use something like a nicotine patch or nicotine gum, but really try to transition them off of it with our more traditional smoking cessation methods.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in is, are the e-cigs that have nicotine in them worse than the ones that don't?
Say that question again?
Are the e-cigs that are loaded with nicotine,
I see.
consider those to be worse than the ones that don't contain nicotine?
So worse is defined in many different ways. Okay, so if it makes you addicted, I'd rather you not be addicted. Nicotine has been a fair amount of research. There's a myth out there that nicotine itself is a carcinogen and can cause cancer. Probably is not the case. I mean, it's very bioactive and it does promote some pathways that are part of cancer, but as best as we could see in humans, as opposed to laboratory studies, the real toxicity of nicotine is the addiction. And with the legitimate concern that there may be some toxicity in terms of developing brains like in adolescence. So a nicotine with and with, an e-cig with and without nicotine, you know, the harm is really about its addictive potential and even a gateway to smoking. There are people who are buying, mostly young adults, e-cigs without the nicotine because they're worried about the nicotine because it causes cancer. Again, I'd rather them not have the nicotine. But they're more sporadic users. They're doing it because they like the technology, they like the flavor, they think it looks cool, that sort of thing.
Yeah, understood.
But
okay.
Having said that, I'm sorry. So let me say something. So the question though is nicotine added to those carriers that might cause some inflammation? Is that going to be worse for some pathway to disease? We just don't know. And so my recommendation is if we don't know, then you shouldn't be messing around with it.
Well, I think that's a great way to conclude our presentation today. I think those are the last of the questions we've got from the audience. And again, I think I want to speak for all of our attendees and on all of the organizations that are using CancerBridge. We really appreciate the work you're doing on this issue and appreciate your time today. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for listening.
All right.
Bye.
Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.